Welcome to this new Tech Captains episode. So, in this episode with Gareth today, we are happy to welcome Chad Sanderson. Hi, Chad. How are you today?
Hey folks, how are you?
Good, good. I mean, very, very interesting guest today because Chad, you've worked as a product manager in companies like Oracle, Subway, Microsoft. You manage a Slack community of almost 7,000 people talking data. You have roughly 60,000 followers on LinkedIn. You're a scout for Sequoia Capital, and all of it starting with a degree in journalism. So, how did all of that happen?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, when I went to college I went to university. It's called Georgia Southern. I'm from Georgia in the United States originally, and my dad was an English teacher, and so I always thought that I would grow up and be a writer. And originally was going after a creative writing degree, and switched it to journalism when I realized I probably wasn't going to be able to get a job writing poetry. And the first job I ever had was actually a journalism job. I was living in Thailand, and I was going into these big sort of stadium events to cover sports, and I did that for a few years. And I was barely making any money. And then at some point, I took over my own website, and I started doing a lot of social media analytics and just trying to figure out how to optimize the number of people landing on the website and that would donate to me. And I got really interested in that whole sort of process, like Google Analytics and Mixpanel and sort of all of these different types of tools seemed really interesting and appealing. So I ended up leaving journalism. I went back to the US and I got a job as a data analyst at a relatively small company. Ended up teaching myself statistics, and then from there, I was hired as a data scientist, and then eventually went to work for Oracle. And then at Oracle, I shifted more over to the infrastructure ownership and sort of product management side for experimentation specifically, which is where my focus on had been at that point.
Oh, I love that journey. Yeah, I love that journey. It's unusual.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
so how did you find the learning programming by yourself? Which is the way most developers have done, actually.
Yeah. Well, I just so I started. Funnily enough, I didn't know the right order to learn any programming languages in. So I actually started with R, and
Okay.
because I was doing a lot of experimentation, as I mentioned, and so like I needed to learn how to do like t-tests and figure out what statistical significance was, and do all these like other various types of modeling techniques. So I just bought a bunch of books, and I would go to work, and it wasn't really there wasn't really anybody to teach me on the job, and so I would just like every day I would go to work, I would just try out something new from the book in that pretty low pressure environment, and it started working, and I yielded some pretty good results from some of the experiments that we were doing on the website, and then that's what I used to get the Oracle job. Basically, it's like, look at all these interesting experiments I've done.
I see. And if I look, for example, at your time at Microsoft, I think in 2018, 2019,
Mhm.
you were working on the AI platform when at the time the buzzword was more into blockchain, and you were a senior program manager, and you've worked in. So you were not a product manager, you were a program manager, but you're still working a lot with Python and R. What was it about exactly you were doing?
Yeah, so Microsoft's AI platform was a internal team at Microsoft, and they focused on supporting the big AI and machine learning oriented use cases at the various other companies within Microsoft, right? Like Microsoft is not one company; it's actually like a lot of companies that were acquired over time, and oftentimes have very distinct data ecosystems. So like Bing has one data ecosystem; they use a certain compute fabric. They'll use like Spark ML, and then another team will use something totally different. Like they might use something internal to Microsoft. Xbox is going to use something different. Windows is going to use something different. And our job was to supply experimentation machine learning and sort of metric computation capabilities to all of these teams. And that meant that we had to integrate with all these like variety of pipelines, and there was a lot of use cases that we needed to support. And so that was the main work that I was doing there. Was essentially it was called a program manager, but I mean, Microsoft didn't really have a product manager title, but that's effectively what the work was. It was like prioritizing, what sort of which customers, internal customers, we needed to go after, how we should optimize onboarding them, and then what features should we add to the platform to enable new use cases for experimentation.
That's really interesting to me, because I mean, I saw the numbers you had on there around how many experimentations they were running. So it sounded like that organization within Microsoft is sort of almost like a services consulting organization that people come and say, I want to run this experiment. This is roughly what I want to use. And you guys would come up with a solution, a software, possibly even a hardware solution, and deliver that to them. Is that how that worked?
Yeah, so we had a central platform, and everyone could integrate with the platform. But because, like I mentioned, it was just supporting so much complexity, it would usually require a bit of hand holding. And so we would have a software engineer and a PM and someone else that would kind of onboard them to the system. And then depending on the use case that they had, it may require additional services on our part. So we had like a data science team, and that data science team would help these other organizations run the experiments that they needed to, help them create the metrics, like figure out what they needed to measure in the first place, which logs they needed to collect if they didn't have them, help them analyze the experiment if they didn't already have those resources, and then actually run things through the platform, and then give them all the tools so that they could ideally do it themselves in the future.
So it's interesting, because this must have been a fabulous incubator for you, reading now what you've become and what you do and what we're going to talk about. I mean, I can actually see how that was just an amazing place for you to come up with your ideas, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's great things about Microsoft and not so great things. I mean, I guess it just depends on how you look at it. The great things is I learned a lot about influencing culture there, because Microsoft is a very um, fragmented company. Each organization has a separate CVP, and they have their own values and projects and KPIs, and have their goals that they're working on. And that's going to be really different from someone else's goals that they're working on. I think under Satya, this has changed a little bit, and the organization is definitely more aligned with each other. But when I was there, it was still tough, and so that meant that our CVP and by extension the sort of PMs within the AI platform were spending a lot of time, like basically going around the business and trying to convince these executives of why they should actually measure the success of a feature that they deployed. The culture back then was just like, hey, I'm every 6 months we ship a new version of Windows, and then we all go have a party. It's like, well, did that
Right.
work? Like, is it better? Is it actually making more money? Like, unless you're taking this very experiment oriented approach, it's kind of hard to know that. And so we were sort of that was a really interesting thing that I learned how to do pretty effectively, is have those high level cultural conversations and get people to do something that may not appear to be in their best interest, right? Because it's always harder to slow down your shipping speed than to speed up. So that was really interesting. And then of course there was a lot of really technical things that I picked up. But the hard part is that when you're in an organization that's that kind of fragmented, ultimately you kind of have to enable the customer with the megaphone, so to speak. So whoever makes the company the most money is probably going to get the feature. Bing was our biggest customer. They had the most data. They ran the most experiments. Bing in Microsoft Office. And that means that the features that we built were uniquely tailored to them, whereas there might be other sort of smaller organizations within Microsoft, like Microsoft Teams, for example, or Cortana, that were doing really interesting AI-oriented things, and we just couldn't really help them that much.
That's very interesting, the way it works internally. Like you see the same at Amazon, where Amazon.com e-commerce is the biggest client of AWS, and they have their own dedicated team taking care of them. And that leads me to think, because obviously you've had a number of different professional experiences. We're not going going to go through all of them. It's not an interview for a job, but I'm also interested to see like what puts you into the venture capital world. Like, what's the reason that they got in touch with you, or you got in touch with them, and that you were interested in it?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been interested in startups and VC, but the way that I entered the world was actually kind of by happenstance. I was living in a town right outside of Seattle, right to the east of Seattle, called Kirkland, and basically right before the pandemic started, maybe a year before the pandemic started, I was just trying to meet new people because I was new in the area, and there was this app called Coffee Break. I don't even know if it's still around, but it was sort of like Tinder for business professionals, which is a little bit cringy, but I was kind of desperate and I didn't know of a better way of doing it. And one of the guys that I ended up matching with was an early stage VC who was also based out in Kirkland, and he was interested in meeting with me because at the time I was leading the data platform team for Convoy, and he had some investments in the data infrastructure and ML space, and so I was kind of like a target customer for a lot of his companies, and so we met up, and he was actually just starting to raise his first official fund. Prior to that, he was just doing angel investing, and he's like, "Yeah, your experience is awesome. Do you want to be an LP? Do you want to be an investor in my fund?" And I said, "Yeah, that sounds great. Like, I have never been interested in that type of thing, but I would be happy to do it. I have some extra money lying around." So I put some money in, and then from there, really, I just ended up getting a bunch of introductions through that. Like, I had a whole lot of portfolio companies that started to reach out for me, ask for my expertise and advice, and sometimes the portfolio companies would say, "Hey, Chad, like, you're really bullish on this idea. Would you mind talking to our investors and just kind of backing us up?" And I would go and do that, and then that investor would say, "Hey, like, you're really thoughtful about some of these things. Like, do you want to work with me on some project? Like, I have a portfolio company I want to talk with you about." And sort of one thing led to another, and eventually I ended up meeting with some of the folks on the Sequoia Capital side of things, and I worked with them and had sort of reoccurring meets and sort of company reviews with them for about a year and a half, and they say, "Hey, your advice has been very, very valuable. Do you want to be a part of our Scout program, which runs every 2 years?" And I said, "Yeah." So that's essentially how that happened.
No, but that's very interesting. And so, what would you say today is your main activity? Is it like being a scout for Sequoia, or it's running your data community, something else, nothing, everything?
So my main activity these days is consulting and also running the community. So I work with a set of pretty large businesses on the technical implementation of data contracts, which is one of the things that I talk about a lot through my LinkedIn. So there are some pretty big businesses that you've probably heard of that are like very interested in going down the contracting approach, and I will help them both from the cultural side and also from like the implementation of a platform. So I spend a lot of time doing that, and then I also spend a lot of time on the community, like you said, the data quality camp, and that's mainly just because I was having a bunch of conversations with folks through LinkedIn and other channels, and there wasn't a very clear there wasn't a clear consensus of how you implement data quality at scale. It's usually something that people started thinking about once stuff began to break down, and that's not good. And people were sort of desperate, and the only information they could really find was from vendors on Google. And I wanted it to be more of a community-driven, practitioners who would actually solve the problem, sharing information with people who are looking for answers. So yeah, that's great, and I'd love to start doing more events. So I think this year we're going to do a few more events and hopefully do a conference. That's kind of the big goal I'm aiming for with that. And then I'm also working on a book. So I just started working on a book um, a few days ago actually, and so that'll probably eat up a lot of my time over the next year.
What's the topic of the book?
It's on data contracts.
So can I ask about them? So I'm just going to quote from something I read that you wrote. So you said, while connecting ELT CDC tools to a production database seems like a great idea, to easily and quickly load important data, this inevitably treats database schema as a non-consensual API. I thought that was a great phrase. And then you said engineers often never agreed or even want to provide this data to consumers. Without that agreement in place, the data becomes untrustworthy. So why are you so passionate about this? And you obviously are. I mean, that article I read was fantastic that I pulled that from. But why are you so passionate about it? What drives you on this?
So there's a few things. One of the reasons I'm so passionate is because I feel that data data. This may sound like a very obvious and basic thing to say, but I think data is extraordinarily important, and I think that there are many businesses. Just to take a step back in the 1970s and 1980s, data was actually treated with a lot of importance and respect in an organization. In fact, data preceded software, right? People were implementing data warehouses before they were building applications. And there was usually a lot of ROI in doing that, right? Like if you're Ford, I think it was maybe in the late 80s or early 90s, Ford actually constructed this data warehouse so that they could figure out where there were bottlenecks, in their manufacturing process. They found those and they were able to save $1 billion. So it was, potential massive ROI on these data investments. And then what happened was software started coming along. Software began eating the world in the whole, Andreessen Horowitz quote. And every single business decided, well, we need to now become a software company and hire a whole bunch of software engineers. And then everything started moving to the cloud. And what you started to see was this shift away from data as the centerpiece of the technology to software as the centerpiece of the technology. And a lot of the technology workflows then began following the software engineering best practices instead of the data engineering best practices. And the state of the world.
So data became a byproduct.
That's right.
It's almost like data became a byproduct in a way at that point.
Exactly. Data became a byproduct. And what a lot of these companies did is they looked at the Googles of the world and Facebooks and Amazon and some of these other folks, and they said, well, you know what, we're going to emulate them. We're going to emulate their organization structure because obviously it worked, and we're going to move to the cloud, and we're going to put all of our data there, and we're going to try to move as fast as possible. And I think that the Facebook, Google, Meta, whatever, I think that model and how they balance data and software is actually not right for a lot of companies. Like companies need to think a little bit more carefully about that, and that results in if you make the wrong choices in how you manage your data and how you prioritize it, it can result in really disastrous consequences, disastrous financial consequences. And depending on, like, especially now, as we're going to machine learning and AI, and these AI and ML systems are going to be making predictions that could affect a person's real life, right? You're making a prediction on what their credit score is. And like, does someone deserve to get access to a loan? Or are we detecting malignant cancer? Or is a vehicle making the right decision on the road? Like, all of these are data problems. They're not software problems. And if your software foundations are bad, it means that these AI models that are going to become the foundation of like our existence as people are going to make bad decisions. And that's not a good thing.
Do you think that there are cases where relying purely on data can lead you to misguided decisions?
You mean like just generally speaking, like when you make decisions?
Yeah, like you were head of product. Like, do you think that there's a number of instances where one shouldn't look at the data, or not only at the data, or go against the data?
Well, and I mean, this might be a slightly this might be a it could be a matter of semantics here, but I consider all information to be data. So even if you're just going down on the street and talking to someone, like that is a data point. I think the question is, do you rely on purely quantitative data that you are pulling from logs in an application, or do you rely on qualitative data that you are collecting from other people that you talk to and through interviews, or maybe even your own personal experiences, which is a form of qualitative data as well. And I would say it depends on the company stage that you're at. If you're an earlier stage company, then I think you're not going to have access to enough quantitative data to really make informed decisions. Like, you're so new that it's like people haven't really plateaued in the way that they're using their platform, and so there's not a huge amount of insight I think that you can even gain from that. It's probably 10 times or even 100 times more effective to just go have a conversation with 3 of your customers than it is to, set up a whole analytics infrastructure. I think once you reach the scale of Microsoft and you have billions of people or billions of queries and hundreds of millions of people using your platforms, then going and talking to an individual person is probably not going to be representative of what the rest of this massive group is experiencing. And so you have to start relying on data. I think there's always going to be a balance, but I think that balance like shifts with the scale of the company.
And so if you were looking, if you were talking to a company today that suddenly realizes they have a huge data problem and they want to get serious about data engineering, possibly because they want to ride this current wave of AI, ML, LLMs, and they want to feed that data into this, well, and they're currently in this sort of wild west of data. What would you recommend that they do?
So what I would recommend, what I would recommend is really to create 2 distinctly separate environments. You need to have one environment for prototyping where you can try out cool stuff like, oh, well, I'm going to put an LLM on top of this data that maybe I don't entirely trust, but I just want to see if it's going to give me and yield any useful information.
Yeah, or a signal of some kind. Yeah.
Or any sort of signal, right? And that needs to be highly iterative and flexible and encourage speed. But you need another environment that is more geared towards the actual productionizing of that use case, and that requires the data to be accurate. And the pipeline which supports that eventual use case should have very clear ownership. It should have data quality checks. It should have like a very clear semantic understanding of what that underlying data means. Like, does this table mean does customer mean a person? Does it refer to a purchase? Does it refer to a visitor? Like, what is that? Like, everybody should be clear on what that data set means, and it shouldn't change. And if it does change, then there needs to be really good change management processes in place, and the downstream like LLM or whatever it is that's sort of sitting on top of all that data needs to be tuned to the changes that are coming in. Like, oh, we're changing the definition of customer to visitor. The LLM has to be aware of that, right? And that like just requires a very fundamentally different infrastructure. But the nice thing is that it applies on a much smaller percentage of the data. So you don't have to do that level of quality everywhere, just on the places that you've already deemed are important.
And Chad, like, just to move a bit from the data topic, we have a tradition in the podcast that the guest presents a book that they really like. And the one that you wanted to present today is a book by Lawrence Core and Jim Stagnito. And the title is Agile Data Warehouse Design, Collaborative Dimensional Modeling from Whiteboard to Star Schema. First, what does that mean? And why that book?
Yeah, that's a long title.
Yeah. So it is a very, very long title. But it's all about data. If people aren't familiar with the concept of a data warehouse, a data warehouse is essentially a framework for storing trustworthy data and supplying that trustworthy data to consumers of it. And in the modern world where we have microservices and everybody is agile, the data warehouse didn't really keep up with the times. It was one of those artifacts from the 70s or 80s. And so this book is kind of about how to create a data warehouse that follows agile principles. And it's something I haven't really seen not that many companies do or talk about. But if you use a lot of the messages, a lot of the frameworks that Jim mentions in the book, I think it will allow data teams to keep up with the times, so to speak.
That's a book I need to read. This is a world I now swim in, so I need to read that book, I think. and just a question then, because just for some people who might be listening to this, how would you describe the difference between a data engineer and a software engineer for someone new to the space?
So a software engineer, I mean, this is a very simple and basic definition, but I think a software engineer is primarily concerned with building customer-facing applications and the services that support them. And data engineers are primarily concerned with constructing pipelines and infrastructure for the data to flow to internal consumers that could then leverage that data to make some decision. So they might use the data in an analytical way, like building a dashboard, or they could use the data in an operational way, like constructing a machine learning model or having some automation built on top of the data. So one is much more about building applications, and the other is a lot more about building pipelines and infrastructure.
I see. I mean, thank you, Gareth. Did you have another question?
Yeah, well, it was kind of related, I think, to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. So, I mean, I was reading some of your articles, and I was thinking there's this observation that tech companies either use data, I suppose I'm going to say overtly or covertly. So, the company I work for, we use it overtly, it's in our name. But I suppose a lot of tech companies, I would say they use it covertly. It's this byproduct we talked about earlier. So why do you think that probably still a lot of the companies that use data in this way don't focus on it with this, at the right level of importance as part of their SDLC? So again, I'm going to quote you, a quote from you today, I think you posted. You said, many of the problems analysts faced when attempting to wrangle data for some use case stem from a failure to include data developers in the planning stages of features launched months or even years ago. So why do you think that companies don't focus on their SDLC?
I think that really all of it comes down to data being a byproduct, kind of as you said, right?
Yeah.
Most people, the data use case is typically going to be secondary. So there's really two main use cases of data. There's using data to support some operational application, and then there's using data as the operational system itself. And both of those actually have the same requirement, which is the application through which the data is extracted must exist first. And a lot of teams who are in this like software engineering first, iterate very fast, it's like, let's ship the product and measure it later, because and honestly, it makes sense, right? Like if I'm going to deploy a new feature, the most important part of that is the feature. Like I need to push it into production. I need to get feedback on it. I need to see if people are using it, and then actually measuring it accurately is oftentimes a second order concern. And it can also be very complicated, because you might realize after you deploy the feature that there's like a certain workflow that you need to measure that you weren't even thinking about before. Like, we deployed a feature that allowed people to use different filters. But actually, once we started doing that, then maybe accessing those different filters push people down a different user journey. And we actually need to know if someone going down that user journey is getting what they expect in the flow of the website, and maybe that makes them drop off, or maybe it makes them buy something, right? You don't really even start thinking about these things until you've seen the product in production. And unfortunately, by the time that happens, it's usually too late, right? Like now you have the data that's coming in via logs was never designed for analytics, and so it takes a lot of work to put it into the right shape. It's usually super messy. It can be very costly. And then on the other side, the operational side, that usually takes even longer before someone finds a use case, right? So someone might say, you might be collecting data about your customers and your purchases and stuff like that for years before you're able to hire a data science or machine learning team that can build a pricing model that's going to pull all of that data into its model as a set of features, and then use it to go do something interesting. And then by the time they're ready to do that, you already have this organizational tech debt that has built up, where the people who own the data, who own the microservice, they're not thinking about machine learning or data science or anything like that. They're just they're thinking about the application, and that creates a lot of challenges as well.
Yeah, and I suppose to your point, in that scenario you gave, you end up in a situation where you haven't thought about that particular change that you made to how the product works. So you're not tracking, you're not getting telemetry from the back end. So now you go, okay, we're going to have to munge it from some Google Analytics event and somehow figure out how we can overlay the one over the other. And yeah, you got a mess then, haven't you, really?
Yeah, exactly. So my perspective is that's probably that workflow is never going to change.
Right.
It's always going to be ship a product, ship a feature, think about measurement later, and then even later than that, think about the operational use case. I think that what teams need to get way better at is the feedback loop between the data team and the engineering team that actually implemented the feature and the logs. That's the piece that doesn't really exist today. It's like once we've realized that some data organized in a particular way is actually very, very important to the business, then we need to have some mechanism of communicating back to that owner team that says, hey, the data that you're emitting as a byproduct is actually really, really important to me. And now I need you to treat it as an API because there's business value there. Right? That's the flow that has to exist and is not very common at the moment.
Perfect. I mean that's very interesting. I mean, Chad, thank you so much for taking the time with us today to discuss data from Seattle. And hopefully, maybe we can invite you again in the future to have a roundtable around data. And thank you for today.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Chad. Nice to meet you.
Nice meeting you too. I enjoyed the conversation.
And for everyone listening, we will be back in 2 weeks with usual with Gareth. My name is Ron, and thank you for listening. Bye bye.